Imagine the marble streets of Rome echoing beneath your sandals as you walk through the Sabura, the city's notorious pleasure district. Lanterns sway above smoky taverns, and laughter spills from curtained doorways where pleasure is bought cheaply and consumed even cheaper. For a senator of Rome, this is already dangerous ground, an arena of vice where reputations dissolve in the shadows. Yet on this night, something far darker grips your heart. You glance toward a common brothel, one you would never dare enter when your gaze freezes. The features before you are unmistakable, even under the crude paint and dim lamplight. It is not a courtesan, nor an ambitious actress desperate for coin. It is Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife of Emperor Claudius. Here, of her own free will, she is servicing clients like the lowest of prostitutes, competing with common women to prove herself insatiable. The sight makes your blood run cold. This is no desperate slave forced to degrade herself. This is the most powerful woman in the empire, sneaking from her palace to lose herself in the filth of the city's back alleys. Rome, of course, was no stranger to decadence. Its aristocracy had long indulged in feasts of excess, private liaisons, and whispered scandals. But what you are about to witness will make Caligula look like a choir boy. For Messalina did not merely indulge. She transformed her sexuality into a weapon, one that would shake the empire to its very core and ultimately lead her to a death as shocking as her life. The irony is sharp. In 38 CE, Rome celebrated her marriage to Emperor Claudius as though Venus herself had blessed the union. Barely 15 years old, she embodied every virtue an empress was expected to represent: youth, beauty, noble lineage, and fertility. To the Roman people, she was the perfect vessel for Rome's future, a patrician daughter destined to preserve divine bloodlines and birth heirs to carry the empire forward. Claudius, 13 years older and hindered by ailments historians now suspect were cerebral palsy, appeared almost grateful to have secured such a prize. Accounts of the time speak of Messalina's classical beauty: golden hair, pale skin, and patrician features that marked her as aristocracy incarnate. At public festivals, she played her part flawlessly, modest, gracious, a living embodiment of Roman feminine virtue. She bore Claudius 2 children and upheld the ceremonial dignity of her station with precision. Yet Roman society was bound by a rigid moral code. Women were divided into 2 castes: the virtuous wives and mothers, guardians of the household, and the prostitutes, entertainers and actresses who existed at the bottom rung of social order. An empress was to stand above reproach. Her honor was not private but public, an extension of Rome itself. Even the faintest rumor of misconduct could rattle the empire, for to dishonor the empress was to dishonor Rome's moral fabric. And so, the contrast between expectation and reality could not have been more dangerous. Behind the polished marble of the Palatine Palace, the girl who smiled serenely at banquets was already unraveling. Servants whispered of unusual disappearances. Guards dismissed late at night. A young woman restless in her gilded cage, seeking something beyond the suffocating rituals of imperial life. At first, it seemed innocent rebellion, but what began as harmless escapades into the city would soon mutate into something calculated, sinister, and wholly unprecedented. Messalina was not merely escaping boredom. She was constructing an alternate identity, one that thrived on scandal and secrecy. She would descend into Rome's most forbidden quarters, slipping into the skin of women who sold themselves nightly, not because she had to, but because the danger thrilled her. This was more than lust. It was a challenge, a conquest, a perverse inversion of power. For the empress who commanded nations discovered that the greater her public dignity, the sweeter the taste of degradation. Her empire was not marble and steel, but flesh, secrecy, and shame. And the path she chose, one that mixed seduction with ambition, would eventually entangle the Senate, the military, and even the emperor himself in a web of scandal so vast that Rome would try to erase her name from history. But erasure, as history has shown, is its own form of immortality. This is the story of Messalina, Rome's third empress, whose hunger for pleasure, control, and danger turned the world's most powerful empire into her stage of ruin. The year was 38 CE. Rome, glittering in triumphs and plagued by whispers of decay, celebrated what appeared to be the perfect imperial wedding. The bride, Valeria Messalina, was still scarcely more than a child, barely 15 years old. Yet she carried the blood of ancient patrician lines, descended from the noble families that had shaped the Republic long before the Caesars transformed it into an empire. She was young, beautiful, fertile, and bound to the divine ancestry that Romans believed safeguarded their future. In her, many saw Venus reborn, a living promise that Rome's destiny would continue unbroken. The groom was Emperor Claudius, 38 years old and in many ways an unlikely emperor. His body bore the marks of weakness. He limped. His speech was sometimes slurred, and his head shook with involuntary tremors. Modern medicine would call it cerebral palsy, but to Romans, such defects were omens of incompetence. For much of his early life, Claudius was hidden away from public affairs, deemed unfit for command. His sudden elevation to emperor after the chaos that followed Caligula's assassination shocked the empire. And yet, his marriage to Messalina seemed to stabilize the fragile image of his reign. For if Claudius appeared flawed, Messalina seemed perfect. Ancient accounts describe her with the serene beauty that epitomized aristocracy. Pale skin untouched by the sun, hair of golden hue carefully styled in patrician fashion, and the delicate, refined features of high lineage. She was the empress Rome wanted to see, dignified in public, gentle at ceremonies, graceful in her duties. She bore Claudius 2 children, Britannicus, a son whose name evoked the conquest of Britain, and Octavia, who would later be married into imperial politics as if she were an offering to the gods. To the Romans, marriage was more than a personal bond. It was a public performance of morality and state order. Wives of the elite were expected to embody chastity, loyalty, and silence. An empress was not simply a wife. She was the living model of pudicitia, the Roman virtue of feminine modesty. In statues and reliefs, she was depicted as the matron par excellence, the unblemished vessel through which divine favor flowed into the empire. This expectation was suffocating. Roman women, especially those of high rank, lived within carefully drawn boundaries. At the top of society, respectable matrons were cloistered symbols of virtue. At the bottom, prostitutes, actresses, and dancers existed in a world of public shame. The line between the two was rigid and absolute, or so Rome believed. For an empress to fall into even the rumor of impropriety was not merely scandal. It was a destabilizing threat to the empire itself. And herein lay the irony that would soon consume Messalina's legacy. For in public, she embodied Rome's ideals so well that her image was untouchable. She attended religious rites beside Claudius, presided over banquets with serene dignity, and appeared the very model of domestic virtue. Every gesture reassured the people that the imperial household was stable, respectable, and divinely protected. But in private, beneath the marble ceilings of the Palatine Palace, something restless stirred. To the servants who brushed her hair, dressed her in silks, and carried her secret messages, she was not a goddess but a young woman chafing against the suffocating weight of perfection. She had fulfilled every expectation: youth, beauty, heirs, public dignity. And yet it was not enough. The role she played so flawlessly was precisely what drove her toward rebellion. Roman history is full of men who defied the boundaries of their station, generals who became emperors, senators who plotted revolutions. But for a woman, especially an empress, to transgress was unthinkable. And perhaps that is why Messalina's descent into scandal was so explosive. It was not merely a personal failing. It was the tearing apart of Rome's most sacred illusion, that the women of its ruling house were untouched by the vices of the street. In this contradiction, between the marble statue of the virtuous empress and the flesh and blood woman hungry for something else, lay the seed of destruction, a seed that would sprout in whispers, then in scandal, and finally in crimes so spectacular that Rome itself would attempt to erase her name. Life within the Palatine Palace was a paradox. For the common people of Rome, it symbolized the pinnacle of grandeur: marble halls, gilded ceilings, and endless banquets. For Messalina, barely past girlhood, it was a cage lined with gold. Each day was scripted: appearances at religious ceremonies, processions through the forum, elaborate feasts where she was expected to sit silent and graceful, her role confined to being an ornament of imperial virtue. But palace servants, those invisible observers of daily life, began to notice subtle shifts. A dismissed guard at an unusual hour, doors quietly opened when they should have been closed, a handmaid whispering about the empress dressing herself in plain wool, clothes more suited to the markets than a palace. At first, such details were dismissed as harmless eccentricities. After all, was she not young, perhaps restless under the suffocating demands of imperial life? Yet patterns emerged. Messalina would feign fatigue at night, sending attendants away earlier than expected. Hours later, shadows moved through the corridors, her silhouette slipping past guards, a cloak drawn low to conceal her golden hair. The empress, whose face adorned statues and coins, sought anonymity in the darkest streets of Rome. What drove her? Some historians suggest boredom, the unending monotony of a life lived as performance. Others point to power, the intoxicating thrill of wielding absolute control in one realm and surrendering herself in another. And still others see in her story something almost tragic, a young woman raised as an icon, suffocated by expectations so rigid that only by breaking them could she breathe. At first, these excursions seemed innocent rebellion. Rome had always been a city of contrasts, senators and generals plotting in the Curia by day, indulging in wine, dice, and courtesans by night. Why should the empress not taste, in secret, the same freedoms her male counterparts enjoyed openly? But what distinguished Messalina was her fascination not with banquets or discreet liaisons, but with the world of prostitutes, the lowest rung of Rome's social ladder. These women were seen as both necessary and despised, tolerated yet degraded. To a Roman matron, to even be mistaken for one was ruinous. For an empress to imitate them was unthinkable. Messalina did not observe casually. She studied them. She watched how they called out to men in the subura, how they bargained, how they endured long nights in cramped chambers. She memorized their gestures, their slang, their survival tricks. It was as though she were preparing for a role, researching not for a single night of rebellion but for a sustained performance. Here was the beginning of her transformation. What began as curiosity became fascination, and fascination became obsession. Soon, her wanderings were no longer spontaneous escapes but calculated maneuvers. She was crafting a second life in the shadows of Rome. In the wider context of Roman culture, her actions were doubly dangerous. The city tolerated indulgence in its men. Senators could gamble, generals could keep mistresses, emperors could indulge in orgies, and their reputations would suffer little. But women, and especially imperial women, were bound by a different law. They were expected to be paragons of restraint, untouched by temptation. To deviate was not simply scandalous, it was destabilizing. Thus, every step Messalina took outside the palace at night was a step closer to tearing down the fragile illusion of Roman virtue. It was not yet known, not yet spoken of in whispers beyond the palace walls, but the seed of disaster had been planted. And like every seed in Rome's fertile soil of decadence, it would grow swiftly, uncontrollably, and with consequences far greater than anyone could have imagined. The turning point came during the Saturnalia festival of 40 CE, a time when Rome itself seemed to invert its order. For 1 week in December, the city abandoned hierarchy. Slaves dined as masters, masters served as slaves, and the strict codes that normally held Roman society together dissolved in a haze of revelry. Gambling, drinking, and public indecency were not just tolerated but encouraged. Saturnalia was chaos institutionalized, a sanctioned release valve for the empire's tensions. It was in this atmosphere of sanctioned disorder that Messalina first crossed the line between curiosity and action. Claudius, occupied with his religious duties and ceremonial obligations, remained unaware of what his young wife had planned. Disguised in the plain garb of a common woman, woolen cloak, hair hidden beneath a scarf, Messalina slipped away from the palace and into the subura, Rome's teeming heart of vice. The subura was a labyrinth of narrow streets and crumbling tenements, a place where the respectable dared not walk at night. Brothels stood shoulder to shoulder with taverns, their entrances lit by oil lamps glowing dimly through heavy curtains. Here, gladiators, sailors, and slaves mingled in a blur of shouting, drinking, and flesh. The air was thick with smoke from cheap fires, the smell of sweat, and the perfume of prostitutes luring customers from doorways. It was Rome at its rawest, stripped of marble facades and senatorial dignity. For Messalina, it was intoxicating. She was not recognized, not revered, not restrained. For once, she was no empress. She was just another woman stepping into the darkness. When she approached a brothel keeper and offered herself for the night, he accepted without hesitation. He did not see an empress. He saw only a mysterious woman of apparent aristocratic background, eager to test her luck in the most degrading of trades. What happened inside those cramped rooms stunned even seasoned workers. Messalina did not act as a timid visitor seeking thrill. She worked with ferocity, as if proving something to herself and to those around her. By dawn, when other prostitutes retired in exhaustion, she demanded more clients. The brothel keeper, bewildered, finally had to send her away. Yet what should have been a shameful secret became, for Messalina, a revelation. She had found not humiliation but triumph. Contemporary whispers, recorded later by Tacitus, suggested that this first night became the seed of obsession. For Messalina, the thrill lay not only in anonymity but in competition. She wanted to prove she could outlast, outperform, and outshine the women who had made this life their survival. It was no longer escape, it was conquest. Roman society had long been built on contests of endurance, gladiators battling until blood slicked the arena, charioteers racing until horses collapsed, generals marching armies across impossible distances. Messalina, in her own way, absorbed this spirit of competition, but where Rome glorified endurance in battle, she transformed it into endurance of flesh. The paradox was staggering. In public, she was the divine matron of Rome. In private, she was testing herself against prostitutes in the subura. These two lives could not coexist forever. But for Messalina, the danger was the allure. The greater the risk, the sweeter the victory. That first Saturnalia descent into the subura was not an isolated act of rebellion. It was the beginning of a double life. One lived in marble palaces beneath the gaze of gods and senators, the other in the filth of Rome's pleasure district, proving again and again that the Empress of Rome could outlast the lowest of its women. And as Saturnalia ended and order was restored across the empire, in Messalina's soul, disorder had only just begun to flourish. In the months after that first descent into the subura, something within Messalina hardened. What had begun as rebellion born of curiosity was no longer a secret thrill. It was a strategy. She had tasted the intoxication of degradation, and rather than recoil, she began to plan its repetition with the precision of a general preparing for campaign. Her nights out were no longer impulsive. She cultivated a small circle of servants who could be trusted absolutely, those who knew that silence meant survival. They smuggled her from the palace at night, provided disguises, and ensured her return before dawn. She commissioned plain garments to conceal her noble form and practiced the mannerisms of prostitutes. How to speak in coarse slang, how to gesture, how to blend into the crowded streets without attracting suspicion. To the world, she was still the luminous empress of Rome, but to the subura, she was just another nameless woman selling herself for coin. It was not mere lust that drove her, it was competition. Rome, after all, was a civilization that thrived on contests. Gladiators fought for survival in the Colosseum. Charioteers risked life and limb in the Circus Maximus. Poets competed for favor in recitations. Victory was Rome's highest virtue, measured not only in triumph over nations, but in the endurance of the body and the spirit. Messalina absorbed this ethos and twisted it. For her, the arena was not marble and sand, but cramped brothel chambers and endless lines of men. She wanted to prove, again and again, that no woman could surpass her in stamina or desire. She was not simply participating. She was setting the rules of a new game, one where her imperial power found expression not through decrees but through flesh. Tacitus, writing with barely concealed disgust, described how she began to study prostitutes as if they were rivals. She learned their techniques, how they paced themselves, how they rotated clients to conserve energy, how they endured nights that broke other women. She treated these observations like lessons for war. Each night out was a campaign. Each man conquered another tally in her pursuit of supremacy. And the stakes were high. Unlike other women of Rome, she had everything to lose. A rumor, a slip of identity, one servant's betrayal, and her name could have brought down the throne itself. But that was precisely what fed her obsession. The more she risked, the more power she felt. It was as though degradation was no longer the punishment but the prize. At court, none suspected. She played her part with elegance. She attended banquets at Claudius's side, presided over religious rites, and bore her children in dutiful silence. But beneath that composure was a double life. One lived in whispers, in shadows, in the sweat-soaked dens of Rome's lowest quarters. The transformation was complete. Messalina was no longer a restless girl seeking escape. She was an empress who had turned prostitution into a calculated ritual of dominance. And soon, her obsession would spill beyond the subura into contests so public, so grotesque, that they would leave even the jaded aristocrats of Rome in stunned silence. By 41 C, Messalina's secret life had evolved beyond furtive nights in the subura. She was no longer content to slip into brothels as a shadow among shadows. Her ambition demanded something greater, something theatrical, something that transformed her private obsession into a public spectacle. And so came the most infamous contest of her reign, the night she challenged Rome's most celebrated courtesan, Scylla, to a battle of endurance. The rules were brutally simple. From sunset to dawn, the woman who could service the most men would claim victory. There was no artistry here, no subtlety, only raw stamina measured in the flesh. The contest was staged not in some back alley brothel, but in a venue prepared for an audience, for Messalina was no longer hiding. She wanted witnesses. Rome's nobility came, drawn by the promise of scandal as much as by the thrill of forbidden entertainment. Senators, equestrians, and wealthy merchants crowded in, wagering fortunes on the outcome. They gathered not merely as voyeurs, but as participants in an obscene inversion of Roman values. In the Circus Maximus, they cheered charioteers. In the Colosseum, they roared for gladiators. Tonight, they placed their bets on an empress against a prostitute. Scylla was a professional. Her fame had spread across Rome not because of beauty alone, but because of her discipline. She knew how to pace herself, how to manage her body through long nights that would have broken others. She approached the contest with the calm of experience, beginning carefully, conserving her energy. Messalina, by contrast, attacked the challenge with ferocity. There was nothing measured in her approach. Each encounter was not merely a transaction but a conquest. Where Scylla endured, Messalina devoured. She refused to yield, refused even to pause. By midnight, the astonishment was palpable. The empress was not only keeping pace, she was surpassing the woman Rome considered unbeatable. By dawn, the contest was over. Scylla, exhausted, collapsed after 25 men. She conceded defeat, certain that no woman could continue. Yet Messalina pressed on, as if driven by a force beyond hunger or desire. She surpassed 30 men before the night ended, not because the contest demanded it, but because she would not stop until there were no more left. The silence that followed was not the jubilant roar of victory. It was horrified stillness. The men who had come to cheer and gamble found themselves staring at something they could not comprehend. The Empress of Rome, wife of the Emperor, proving herself not in temples or ceremonies, but in an endurance contest of flesh. What they had witnessed was not merely scandal. It was the collapse of every boundary Rome had believed sacred. For historians, this moment is pivotal. Juvenal later mocked it in savage satire, describing how the empress, after exhausting all comers, still begged for more. Tacitus recorded it with grim detachment, as though words alone could scarcely capture the enormity of what had occurred. And yet, behind their disgust lay acknowledgement. What Rome had seen was unprecedented. This was not desperation. This was choice. Messalina, the most powerful woman in the empire, had deliberately placed herself in competition with prostitutes, and in so doing had redefined shame itself. The thrill for her did not lie in sex alone. It lay in the inversion of power. To be empress by day and prostitute by night was not contradiction. It was the very source of her ecstasy. The greater the distance between her public dignity and her private degradation, the more intoxicating the victory. In that night's contest, Messalina proved something terrifying, that her hunger for domination could not be contained within the marble walls of the palace. She had discovered a new arena, an empire of shame, where she ruled more absolutely than Claudius ever could in the Senate. After the contest of 41 CE, Messalina could no longer be dismissed as a bored empress indulging in reckless nights. What had begun as scandal had become system. Her obsession with competition and conquest transformed into an organized operation, one sustained by networks of servants, disguises, and careful planning. She had shifted from participant to orchestrator, from rebel to ruler of a hidden empire within Rome itself. She perfected the art of disappearance. Loyal slaves escorted her in secrecy, smuggling her through side gates of the Palatine under cover of darkness. False identities were created with almost theatrical detail, different wigs, varied dialects, and forged names whispered in the subura. Messalina was no longer playing at rebellion. She was building a second life with the discipline of a military campaign. And yet, whispers spread. Rome's aristocracy was decadent, but even its most jaded circles found themselves unsettled. Rumors of the empress competing against prostitutes began to circulate in private gatherings. No one dared confront Claudius directly. His naivety was both a shield and a trap. He remained blissfully unaware, buried in paperwork, grain shipments, and military administration, while his wife ruled another, darker court in the streets. Why did no one act? Fear was part of it. Messalina was not an ordinary woman. She was the wife of the emperor. To accuse her of such degradation without proof was to risk immediate ruin. But beyond fear lay shame. Those who witnessed her contests, those who whispered of her midnight adventures, were themselves compromised. To speak was to admit complicity. Silence was self-preservation. Historians struggled to comprehend the full scale of her descent. Tacitus recorded fragments, stories so lurid they seemed exaggerated, and yet corroborated by others. Juvenal, in his biting satire, mocked her as a creature insatiable, a woman who abandoned the palace at night to take her place in the brothel and leave only when even the last man had gone. Satire exaggerates, but exaggeration requires a seed of truth. What terrified Rome was not only her lust but her method, for there was calculation beneath the chaos. Messalina was not simply indulging desire. She was turning degradation into structure, a parallel system of power. Her life became an unholy rhythm. By day, empress in marble halls, by night, courtesan in the subura, and between both, a strategist weaving control through secrecy. This duality fascinated and horrified her contemporaries. Rome was accustomed to emperors behaving monstrously. Caligula had taught them that. But an empress, a woman meant to embody the sacred virtue of pudicitia. This inversion was more destabilizing than 100 corrupt senators, for it suggested that the very heart of Rome's moral order was rotten. And Messalina was only beginning. What started as scandalous contests would soon evolve into a system far more dangerous, one that weaponized sexuality itself, not for thrill alone, but for control. By 42 CE, Messalina had crossed a boundary from which there was no return. What had once been whispered scandal became something far more audacious, a criminal enterprise built not in shadows, but under the protection of the imperial crown. She did not merely play the role of a prostitute. She became the architect of Rome's most infamous brothel. The operation was cloaked in elegance. A luxurious villa near the Campus Martius, outwardly a private club for Rome's elite, served as the stage. To the casual observer, it was another of the aristocracy's indulgent salons, where senators and merchants gathered for feasts and conversation. But behind the gilded doors, Messalina had created an establishment unlike anything the empire had ever seen. Her recruits were not common prostitutes. They were women of noble blood, aristocratic wives and daughters coerced into service. Some were blackmailed with threats against their families, others trapped by debts or political vulnerabilities. What appeared voluntary was, in truth, compulsion. And Messalina, wielding the authority of an empress, was the enforcer. For her, this was more than debauchery, it was strategy. Each liaison became an opportunity for intelligence. Senators, military commanders, and wealthy merchants, lured into the villa's embrace, spoke freely under the haze of wine and pleasure. Unbeknownst to them, servants listened, recorded details, and memorized weaknesses. Who opposed Claudius in the Senate? Which general harbored ambitions of treason? Which merchant concealed smuggling operations? Every whisper was gathered and delivered to the empress. In this, Messalina showed a cunning that horrified later historians. Tacitus, though disgusted, admitted the sophistication of her methods. She had transformed the brothel into a honey trap, a web of political espionage where sexual shame became a leash around Rome's most powerful men. And the trap was inescapable. To resist her invitations was to risk imperial displeasure. To participate was to be compromised forever. Many discovered only afterward that the woman they had lain with was the empress herself, or worse, the wife of a fellow senator. The realization struck like poison. In a society where honor defined reputation, the shame was unendurable. Silence was the only protection. The impact rippled through Rome's institutions. Senators who once debated freely grew cautious. Military officers who should have focused on campaigns seemed hesitant, distracted. Trade decisions began to favor inexplicably chosen merchants. Foreign envoys noticed irregularities in negotiations, strange hesitations, sudden concessions. Behind it all lay Messalina's brothel, a private court of corruption that eclipsed the Senate's marble halls. What she created was not only a den of pleasure, but a system of control, one that corrupted the very bonds on which Rome rested: marriage, honor, and trust among its ruling elite. In destroying those, she placed herself above them all. But there was a darker truth beneath even this. For Messalina, the brothel was not merely about power. It was about the thrill of dominance, the satisfaction of watching Rome's nobility debase themselves, of turning the guardians of empire into her playthings. The empire that thought it ruled the world was, in her villa, ruled by her. The brothel was not Messalina's indulgence alone, it was her weapon. Where others saw debauchery, she saw an empire of leverage. Every senator who crossed her threshold, every general who succumbed to temptation, every merchant who whispered secrets into her ear was another thread in the web she spun around Rome's ruling class. The brilliance of her scheme lay in selection. Unlike common prostitutes who serviced anyone who paid, Messalina targeted her clients with precision. Senators with influence over grain supply, commanders stationed along volatile frontiers, merchants who handled imports of luxury goods. Each encounter was carefully staged, each moment exploited for information. Her network of servants functioned as spies. They recorded conversations, cataloged indiscretions, and memorized every careless word spilled in the haze of desire. Later, these details would surface at opportune moments, subtle threats, reminders whispered in corridors, favors demanded without explanation. A senator who once considered opposing Claudius's decrees would suddenly fall silent. A general with dreams of rebellion would mysteriously become compliant. Shame was the leash, and Messalina held it firmly. The genius of her control was that it required no open accusation, no public trial. Rome's leaders silenced themselves. They knew what had happened in the villa, and they knew who had been watching. Silence was survival. Compliance was the only option. And so Rome's governance warped. Policies bent toward strange beneficiaries. Military appointments went to men of questionable talent but unquestioned obedience. Trade concessions favored obscure merchants suddenly tied to imperial favor. Foreign ambassadors, puzzled by Rome's irregular decisions, began writing reports back to their homelands of a court gripped by unseen influence. This was power more insidious than swords or legions. Armies could be crushed, laws repealed, conspiracies exposed. But shame was invisible and permanent. A man stripped of honor could never reclaim it. To oppose Messalina meant dragging one's own disgrace into the light. Few dared risk it. The Romans had always feared female power, not because women lacked influence, but because their influence operated in the private sphere, unseen yet profound. Mothers shaped sons, wives whispered to husbands, mistresses stirred jealousies. But Messalina had transformed this private influence into public domination. She turned the bedroom into a battlefield. And in that battlefield, Rome's strongest men crumbled. Later moralists would describe her as a monster, a figure of insatiable lust. But beneath their disgust is something more chilling, an acknowledgement of her effectiveness. Messalina understood human weakness better than any general understood strategy. She weaponized intimacy, corrupted trust, and forged a dominion based not on loyalty or law but on humiliation. In the streets, the people still saw her as a radiant empress, mother of heirs, embodiment of divine lineage. But behind the villa's closed doors, she was something else entirely, a puppeteer of shame, tugging at strings no one dared admit existed. And for Messalina, this was not the climax. This was only the foundation. Once she had ensnared Rome's leaders in her invisible net, she would demand more power, more spectacle, more public domination. The brothel was the beginning of her empire of humiliation. But soon she would drag it from the shadows into the light of ritual, transforming private scandal into public theater. By 44C, secrecy no longer satisfied Messalina. The brothel, for all its sophistication, was hidden, cloaked behind marble walls and guarded whispers. But Messalina craved something bolder. She wanted not only to control Rome's elite in private, but to humiliate them in public. Her obsession transformed again, this time into a grotesque theater where sex became ritual, and ritual became a weapon. The stage was religion. Rome was a city bound together by gods, festivals, and sacred rites. Attendance at ceremonies was not optional. It was a civic duty, a declaration of loyalty to Rome itself. Messalina seized on this obligation, using it as a veil for her darkest experiments. She organized gatherings under the pretense of honoring deities, banquets to Bacchus, processions to Venus, rites for fertility and harvest. Senators, their wives, and aristocratic families were summoned as though to worship. In reality, they were being lured into a trap. At first, the events unfolded with solemn dignity. Altars were lit, hymns chanted, offerings made. But slowly the atmosphere shifted. Wine flowed too freely, dancers entered with suggestive movements, and Messalina herself, radiant, commanding, announced that these ceremonies required deeper authenticity. What began as ritual slipped into intimacy, and intimacy into outright debauchery. The escalation was deliberate. Step by step, Messalina stripped away the participants' defenses. By the time senators and their wives realized what was happening, they were already complicit. To object was to expose themselves. To leave was to invite suspicion. And so, trapped by their own fear, they submitted. These were not private orgies, whispered about in taverns. They were carefully orchestrated spectacles where Rome's ruling class performed their degradation under the empress's gaze. The message was unmistakable. She controlled not only their bodies but their reputations, their very ability to appear virtuous before the people. For Messalina, the power was intoxicating. She forced rivals into obscene pairings, laughing as once proud senators groveled before their peers. She turned aristocratic matrons into performers, erasing the boundary between noble women and prostitutes. Some accounts even suggest she involved younger members of elite families, claiming their participation was necessary for religious authenticity. If true, it meant no generation was spared from her web of shame. The effect was devastating. Senators who had once thundered with confidence in the Curia now spoke timidly, their eyes avoiding hers. Military leaders who commanded legions shrank into silence, fearful of the secrets she held over them. Diplomats from foreign lands wrote puzzled reports describing Roman officials as nervous, hesitant, submissive, as though an invisible hand gripped them all. That hand belonged to the empress. These public orgies were not entertainment. They were demonstrations of dominance. They revealed that Rome's ruling class, clothed in togas of dignity, could be stripped bare and remade into actors in her perverse theater. The empire was not being governed through law, nor through military force, but through shared humiliation so deep that no one dared speak of it. In the history of Rome, few spectacles matched the audacity of Messalina's sacred orgies. They were both performance and punishment, a grotesque reminder that the empress held the fate of Rome's greatest men and women in her hands. What began as secret rebellion in the Subura had become political theater played out under the guise of worship. And yet, for Messalina, even this was not enough. The orgies were her masterpiece, but she hungered for something more final, more dramatic, a way to elevate her private fantasies into a new imperial reality. Soon, she would attempt a transformation so shocking that it threatened not only reputations, but the very throne itself. The orgies Messalina orchestrated were not mere indulgence. They were laboratories of humiliation. She understood that the surest way to destroy a man was not to kill him, but to strip him of dignity before his peers. Rome's elite, men who had triumphed on battlefields or thundered in the Senate, now found themselves reduced to actors in her grotesque theater. Imagine a senator who once commanded respect with every word, forced now to perform degrading acts before colleagues who dared not meet his gaze. Messalina relished orchestrating such scenes, pairing rivals together and mocking them as they stumbled through her commands. Their shame was her entertainment, their silence her guarantee of power. And it was not only the men who were undone. Noble matrons, women raised to embody pudicitia, the sacred Roman ideal of chastity and modesty, were compelled to take part. Some were coerced through threats, others trapped by the inevitability of spectacle. To refuse was impossible. To participate was ruin. The boundary that had always separated Rome's noblewomen from its prostitutes dissolved under Messalina's hand. For her, this erasure was the point. If she could make patrician wives indistinguishable from the courtesans of the subura, then she had rewritten the very order of Roman society. What horrified observers most, however, was how far she was willing to extend her reach. Accounts whisper that adolescents, the sons and daughters of Rome's leading families, were drawn into these sacred rites, their innocence exploited under the guise of ancient religious authenticity. If true, it meant Messalina had not only corrupted individuals but poisoned entire bloodlines, binding Rome's next generation to the same cycle of silence and shame. Parents, trapped in their own complicity, could not protect their children without exposing themselves. The psychological toll was immense. Senators who once plotted against emperors now cowered, unable to oppose her. Generals who should have led legions with confidence appeared hesitant, broken men more fearful of secrets than of swords. Foreign ambassadors, observing the strange submissiveness of Rome's elite, reported home in confusion. Why did senators who once debated fiercely now seem nervous and restrained? Why did commanders who commanded legions act like men under invisible chains? The answer was Messalina's genius. She had discovered that sexual humiliation was more effective than executions or exile. A man killed becomes a martyr. A man degraded becomes a ghost, alive but silenced, incapable of resistance. She weaponized not fear of death but fear of exposure. Even Rome's traditional structures could not withstand this corruption. The Senate, supposedly the guardian of law and tradition, had been bent into complicity. Aristocratic families, once proud of their lineage, now bore stains they could never speak of. The empire's social fabric, woven from honor, hierarchy, and virtue, was fraying at its core. And Messalina thrived in that unraveling. She had transformed shame into empire, degradation into dominion. But power built on humiliation is fragile, for it feeds endlessly and demands escalation. What began as whispers in the subura had become grand public rites of degradation. Soon, even this would not satisfy her, for Messalina was no longer content to manipulate from the shadows. She wanted to rule not just through blackmail and spectacle, but through open declaration. The stage she had built would soon host a performance so shocking it would force even her most compromised allies to confront her head-on. Through all of this, the brothels, the contests, the public humiliations, one question haunts history: where was Claudius? How could the Emperor of Rome remain blind while his wife turned the empire into her private stage of corruption? The answer lies partly in Claudius himself. He was a scholar at heart, more comfortable with scrolls than with swords. Unlike his predecessors, Claudius was not a creature of spectacle. He spent long hours studying legal codes, overseeing grain shipments, and drafting edicts. His devotion to administration, while it stabilized the empire, also left him vulnerable. He believed in institutions, in the careful machinery of governance. And so he trusted the men and women around him, trusted too easily. Messalina exploited that trust with merciless precision. In public, she was the image of the dutiful wife. She bore Claudius' children, attended ceremonies at his side, and maintained the appearance of modest dignity. She shielded her nocturnal life so thoroughly that to him, her devotion seemed unquestionable. The emperor, who had long endured mockery for his stammer and limp, may even have felt grateful that such a radiant young wife had bound herself to him. But beyond personal blindness, there was another, more insidious reason for his ignorance: fear. The senators, generals, and aristocrats who might have exposed her were themselves ensnared in her web. Each man who could have whispered truth into Claudius's ear was compromised by his own shame. To reveal her crimes would be to reveal their own. Silence was safer. Even Claudius's trusted freedmen, men like Narcissus and Pallas, walked a tightrope. They may have suspected more than they admitted, but until the scandal reached a point of no return, even they hesitated to bring it forward. To accuse the empress without undeniable proof was to risk their lives. And so Messalina thrived in the shadows. She moved through the palace like a creature of two faces, the serene empress by day, the calculating predator by night. Her duplicity was not accidental, it was art. The more impeccable her public image, the easier it was to conceal the abyss beneath it. For years, this balance held. Claudius managed the empire with diligence, believing he presided over a household of virtue. Messalina, meanwhile, expanded her dominion of shame, secure in the knowledge that the emperor's trust and his court's silence made her untouchable. Rome functioned, but it functioned under a spell. Laws were passed, legions marched, taxes were collected. Yet beneath the surface, decisions bent strangely as if guided by invisible currents. Foreign envoys sensed it. Merchants profited from it. Senators endured it in silence. An empire ruled not by decree but by the whispered terrors of humiliation. And Claudius, the man who should have seen, did not. Perhaps he could not. For the greatest illusion Messalina ever crafted was not in the suburra or the villa, but within the emperor's very household. The illusion that she was what Rome demanded her to be, a perfect wife, mother, and empress. But illusions, no matter how carefully woven, cannot last forever. And when they break, they shatter violently. By 48C, Messalina's life of shadow and spectacle had reached a fever pitch. She had conquered Rome's brothels, bent senators to her will, humiliated the nobility in public rites. But none of it was enough. Her appetite demanded something final, something irreversible. And so she crossed the most audacious line of all. She held a wedding. Her chosen groom was Gaius Silius, a handsome senator whose youth, ambition, and naivete made him the perfect pawn. For months, Messalina had pursued him openly, her advances impossible to resist. To refuse the empress was to invite destruction. To accept her attention was to enter a nightmare. In the end, Silius yielded, not out of love but out of the helpless gravity of her obsession. What followed was unprecedented. Messalina, still legally and publicly married to Emperor Claudius, arranged a full Roman wedding with Silius. This was not a secret tryst or symbolic ceremony. It was a lawful union complete with sacred rites, official witnesses, contracts, and public celebration. In the eyes of Roman law, it was valid, which meant astonishingly that she now had two husbands, the Emperor of Rome and a senator barely at the start of his career. For the aristocracy forced to attend, the wedding was an act of open rebellion. Invitations were not requests, they were commands. To decline was treason. To attend was complicity. The guests watched in horror as Messalina, clad not as an empress but as a bride, pledged herself to another man while still wearing the title of Augusta. The celebration stretched for days, blurring into orgy. Wine flowed, music thundered, and Messalina presided over the chaos with the exultant pride of a woman who believed she had remade Rome in her image. Senators who once whispered against her found themselves dragged into the festivities. Their silence demanded, their shame deepened. The spectacle was not only scandal, it was declaration. Messalina was no longer hiding. She had stopped pretending her indulgences were private rebellion or religious ritual. This was an open challenge to the emperor himself. Why did she do it? Historians struggle to explain. Some argue she believed Claudius would never act against her, that his weakness and reliance on her image made him incapable of confrontation. Others suggest she had convinced herself that she could replace him altogether, that with Silius as her new consort, she could seize the throne outright. Whatever the motive, the act was madness. For in Rome, marriage was not simply personal. It was political, legal, sacred. By marrying Silius, Messalina had declared herself independent of Claudius's authority. To the wider empire, it was treason disguised as a wedding feast. To Claudius, when he finally learned, it was betrayal beyond comprehension. To Rome, it was the moment when scandal transformed into crisis, and crisis into impending civil war. The wedding to Gaius Silius was not a hidden affair, nor a fleeting whim. It was the beginning of a dangerous illusion, one in which Messalina believed she could rewrite Rome itself. With the vows spoken, she and her young senator began to act not as lovers in secret, but as emperor and empress of a new order. Messalina, emboldened, referred to Silius as her husband openly, sometimes even as emperor. She issued instructions in his name as though Claudius no longer mattered. In her mind, the transition was already complete. Rome had a new ruling pair, and the old emperor was a relic to be discarded. Those close to her reported that she spoke of coronation plans, of ceremonies to legitimize Silius's rule, of a dynasty reborn through her will. For Silius, the dream soon curdled into terror. At first, flattered by the empress's attention, he enjoyed the privileges her favor bestowed: wealth, prominence, and the illusion of imperial destiny. But he quickly realized he had been drawn into a nightmare. He was no longer a free man, but a figurehead in Messalina's fantasy. To resist her was impossible. To indulge her was dangerous. And above all, he understood what she did not: that Rome would never tolerate such a usurpation without blood. This delusion of a new empire must be understood in the Roman context. Usurpation was not uncommon in imperial history. Senators and generals had long imagined themselves worthy of the purple, and civil wars were sparked by men bold enough to claim it. But what set Messalina's attempt apart was its foundation. Not armies, not decrees, not even conspiracies, but a wedding bed. She was attempting to replace an emperor through the machinery of marriage, believing that her beauty, her influence, and her web of blackmail could achieve what legions normally did with steel. Her confidence was terrifying. She had humiliated senators, bent generals, and silenced rivals. She believed her enemies too compromised to oppose her. Why should Claudius, old, distracted, and mocked by many as weak, be any different? Her entire empire of shame had convinced her she was invincible. And yet, beneath the triumph, cracks appeared. Silius began to plan escape routes, confiding to friends that he feared his own destruction. Aristocrats who had long kept silent now whispered of catastrophe. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing that the empress had finally stepped beyond scandal into open rebellion. The illusion of a new empire was intoxicating to Messalina, but horrifying to those trapped within it. For never before had an empress so openly attempted to replace her husband while he still ruled. It was not only audacity, it was delusion. And delusion in Rome was always fatal. The illusion could not last. For all her cunning, Messalina underestimated one truth about Rome. Secrets never stay buried forever. Her wedding to Silius was too public, too audacious. The city buzzed with whispers, servants gossiped in corridors, and by the time the final revelers staggered away from the feast, Rome itself seemed to know. It was only a matter of time before the emperor learned what had happened in his absence. The first to act were not senators nor generals, but Claudius's freedmen, loyal advisors who had risen from slavery to become the emperor's most trusted confidants. Men like Narcissus, Callistus, and Pallas, who knew that their survival depended on the emperor's stability. They alone had both the courage and the proximity to risk telling him the truth. At first, Claudius refused to believe them. How could he? Even for Messalina, whose reputation for scandal had long troubled the palace, this seemed impossible. Bigamy was no trivial offense. Under Roman law, her marriage to Silius was valid, which meant she had effectively declared herself divorced from the emperor while still bearing the title of Augusta. It was not only betrayal, it was treason wrapped in sacred ceremony. When the freedmen presented evidence, witnesses, contracts, and testimony from those who had attended the ceremony, Claudius's disbelief curdled into rage. He realized he was no longer facing mere personal humiliation, but the threat of a civil war. If Messalina and Silius chose to press their claim, she could use her network of compromised senators and generals to rally support. Rome, still scarred by the memory of Caligula's chaos, teetered on the edge of another violent rupture. The decision was swift. Claudius could not afford hesitation. If he delayed, his throne might slip away, not to an army marching on Rome, but to a wedding vow. He gathered his loyal troops, men untainted by Messalina's webs of corruption, and set out for the capital. His march back from Ostia was no grand procession, but a furious return, a desperate attempt to reassert control before it was too late. For the aristocracy trapped in Messalina's orbit, the air grew heavy with dread. The illusion of safety, of her untouchable power, cracked in an instant. Those who had celebrated her wedding now feared they had tied themselves to a sinking ship. Silius, once flattered by her embrace, now faced the grim realization that his only hope of survival lay in distancing himself from the very woman who had ensnared him. Rome itself braced for confrontation. Whispers ran through the forum, past the markets, into the Subura. Would Claudius forgive, or would he destroy? Would Messalina's empire of shame bend him into submission, or would the emperor strike with the iron of Roman authority? The answer would come quickly and brutally. When Claudius returned to Rome, the illusion that Messalina had built collapsed in a single breath. Her marriage to Silius was no longer scandal, it was rebellion. The emperor, humiliated and enraged, could not allow hesitation. He convened his freedmen, the same men who had exposed her betrayal, and demanded swift action. Their counsel was simple: act immediately, before sympathy or hesitation gave her space to recover. Messalina, realizing the tide had turned, tried desperately to salvage her empire of shame. She fled from her villa to the gardens of Lucullus, seeking refuge in the lavish grounds where Rome's elite had long entertained themselves. Here, surrounded by fountains and groves, she believed she might plead her case, appeal to Claudius's habitual gentleness, and win forgiveness as she had in smaller scandals before. But this was no ordinary transgression. Claudius's advisors understood that as long as Messalina lived, Rome would never be safe. The senators she had humiliated, the generals she had compromised, the matrons she had debased, all remained silent only because of her presence. If she survived, her web of shame would revive. If she died, it would unravel. For the emperor, it was not merely vengeance, it was necessity. As soldiers closed in on the gardens, Messalina's confidence finally broke. Ancient accounts describe her last moments as a mixture of defiance and terror. She demanded her mother help her plead with Claudius, weeping that she was still the mother of his children, still Augusta by name. Yet when she saw the cold faces of the guards, she seemed to understand. Her empire of shame had met the one force she could not corrupt, the raw survival instinct of Rome's throne. Tacitus records that she hesitated at the end, offered the chance to take her own life, a final gesture of Roman dignity. She faltered, trembling, unable to drive the blade into her chest. It was the soldier at her side who struck the killing blow. Others suggest she died screaming, her pride finally consumed by terror. What all accounts agree upon is the swiftness of her fall. In one day, the empress who had enslaved Rome with humiliation was reduced to a corpse in the garden shadows. Claudius ordered no grand trial, no public display. Instead, he commanded erasure. Her statues were torn down, her name scratched from inscriptions, her memory condemned by damnatio memoriae, the Roman ritual of official forgetting. To speak her name was treason. To remember her was forbidden. It was the cruelest irony. Messalina, who had built her dominion on spectacle, who had thrived on being seen and whispered about, was condemned to eternal silence. Rome buried her story under marble and decree, as though pretending she had never existed could cleanse the stain she had left. Yet the memory of her reign lingered in whispers, in satire, in the nervous laughter of senators who had once knelt at her command. Rome had survived her, but not without scars. With Messalina's body cooling in the gardens of Lucullus, Claudius moved swiftly to ensure that her name, her image, her very existence would be erased. The Senate, eager to distance itself from the scandal it had silently endured, supported his decree of damnatio memoriae. Statues of the empress were toppled, her portrait smashed, her name chiseled from inscriptions. To speak of her was dangerous, to recall her a risk. Rome attempted to bury her in silence, yet erasure itself became her immortality. For history remembers most vividly those whom rulers try to forget. The woman who weaponized shame now lived on as a specter of Rome's own guilt. In satire, in whispers, in scandalous accounts copied by historians, her memory proved indestructible. Juvenal sneered at her insatiability. Tacitus recorded her excess with grim precision, and Suetonius folded her tale into the larger tragedy of Julio-Claudian decline. Messalina's paradox was complete. She had risen to power not through laws or armies, but through scandal. She inverted Rome's most sacred ideals, marriage, motherhood, chastity, and transformed them into weapons sharper than swords. By degrading herself, she degraded the empire. By humiliating its elite, she ruled them. And in doing so, she revealed a truth that Romans feared. Power does not always wear armor. Sometimes it whispers in bedrooms, hides behind veils, and conquers through silence. Her death did not cleanse Rome. The same Senate that watched her orgies would later bow to Nero's madness. The same generals who feared her humiliation would fall prey to their own ambition. Messalina was not an aberration but a symptom, proof that Rome's marble order concealed rot beneath the surface. And yet, her story is singular. No other empress before or after dared so openly to transform shame into empire. Her reign of degradation remains unparalleled, not because Rome lacked decadence, but because no one else wielded it with such audacity. Today, Messalina lingers not in statues, those were shattered, but in memory. She lives in every scandalous whisper, every historian's bitter line, every modern retelling that recoils and yet cannot look away. Rome tried to erase her, but in doing so made her unforgettable. Perhaps this is her final victory, that even stripped of marble and title, condemned by decree, she still compels us to ask, how fragile is power when it can be undone not by swords but by shame?